Okay, so let's go through the questions. Normally the groups don't know what questions the others have been answering, so it's quite fun to see how people are surprised by what's been asked. Right, so why do women have sex? I will have two of the newsprints stuck up here from the two groups who answered the question. Hopefully you've had a think about the answers. And it goes something like this. So one of the answers will be, well, women have sex for fun. Sure, they have sex for fun. It can be loads of fun. Some say it will be intimacy with a partner. Yeah, if that's the next step in your relationship and it's a loving relationship, yeah. Then there's experimentation, and yeah, adolescence, and I don't know, you guys are sort of still adolescents, just coming out of it. They say the brain only matures at 25, so you've still got a year to go, a year or two. But yeah, experimentation, sure. Then there's inevitably here wants to have a baby. Now the question is, this is voluntary, as in for women in society, this is always a voluntary decision. And we know very well that there is a huge amount of societal pressure from partners, pressure from in-laws for women to conceive and give an heir, etc. So in fact, a desire to have a child for many women is not 100% voluntary. There are many situations where women are coerced or manipulated or pressured or feel that they have no other option than to have a baby within their relationship. So we chat about this and we debate this, and then everybody agrees that actually it's not always voluntary. There's a lot of societal kind of pressures and coercions, and it gets bumped across to this is a grey area because it depends a lot on a woman's circumstances and how empowered she is in terms of her reproductive health. Okay, then sometimes students will say, well, in the workplace for promotion, and they will see that as an entirely voluntary act, which it may or may not be, firstly. In that actual specific instance and in that moment. But if women are needing to have sex, or kind of it's a requirement in order to be promoted, why is that? And the answer is because, well, maybe if we lived in a completely equitable society where women earned the same job for the same amount of money for the same work as men did, if they had equal opportunities for promotion, maybe it wouldn't need to happen. So what I'm getting at is that there is a societal context to that in a lot of cases. So even though the act itself may be voluntary, and it also might not be, if the circumstances were different and equal, would the woman still choose to behave in that way? Possibly, but possibly not. So the minute there's a yes or no, we would move that across to grey area. Okay, then some students will say sex workers. Well, most students will say prostitutes. You're supposed to say sex workers, guys. They'll say sex work, which is in exchange for money, and sometimes they'll put transactional sex in this column. Transactional sex is in exchange for something other than money, usually, very similar. Now, yes, if you're a sex worker, that's your job and you're doing it voluntarily, but do you think if women had opportunities other than sex work that could earn them as much money, that they would necessarily choose sex work? It's an incredibly high risk job. It's not to say that women would necessarily choose another job. I read an article in Marie Claire, which means it must be true, that there are some sex workers in America who choose sex work over other options because it pays more. But when you look at the nitty-gritty of it, they're choosing sex work against something like being a cashier. They're not choosing sex work versus being a lawyer or being a doctor or having a decent income kind of a job. So sex work, you would probably find the majority of women probably would want to be doing something else. There just hasn't been the education opportunity or whatever the circumstances are. So everybody normally agrees, yes, actually, it probably belongs in a grey area, because most women, if the circumstances were different, would be doing something else. And remember, in order for it to be truly voluntary, they would have to choose this every time, irrespective of the circumstances. Okay? Now, transactional sex, I want to talk a little bit about, because I think there's a lot of this happening, well, just globally, but in South Africa. Transactional sex could be like your blesser, where you're going on trips to Dubai and you are getting all the bling. Or you could be a 16-year-old girl from Khayelitsha, a much older man who is paying for your school fees or your grandmother's rent or food, or something much more like bare necessities than bling and diamonds. So there's lots of transactional sex in this country, and we see this a lot in impoverished communities. And again, if those, it's usually younger women, if those young women had other options or better opportunities, would they necessarily be entering into something like this? Because that power dynamic immediately sets them up for a risk of a whole lot of things. So after we have a discussion, everybody decides, yes, actually, that probably belongs more in grey area. Okay, so we're going to come back to grey area. That leaves us with fun, intimacy, and experimentation as truly voluntary choices for women to have sex. Now, the involuntary column. So everybody, I mean, I've already given you the first comment, okay? Sex is not rape, rape is not sex, but we have to talk about rape in the context of intercourse and termination of pregnancy. So everybody will write rape, and some will remember to write child abuse, because that is also clearly involuntary. And then I asked the class to take a step back a little bit and think about all the different types of situations where a woman might be vulnerable to rape. So who are the populations that are particularly vulnerable to this happening? I mean, any woman within a relationship, on the street, we are at risk. It's not to say that men aren't at risk, but we are at higher risk. But who are the groups who are at particularly high risk? Okay, so let's have a look. So I don't know if you guys remember the Bring Back Our Girls campaign, where Boko Haram kidnapped a whole lot of girls, and it is thought that the aim of that was to take them across the border and marry them off to the soldiers. So that is human trafficking, sex trafficking. Places like Europe, where a beautiful Russian woman will be kidnapped and taken across the border. Passport is confiscated and they get her hooked on heroin, and now she has to pimp herself out to pay for her way with whoever has kidnapped her. Sex trafficking like that. And it's not just north of our border and far away in Europe, but there's a significant amount of sex trafficking in this country. And it happens all over. There are these major hotspots in Hillbrow and Joburg, where those high-rise flats are full of women who've been trafficked across the border from the north. But it happens in the Eastern Cape. Young girls are kidnapped and forced into marriages in this very country. So it's something that we are not immune to. Okay, other kind of groups who are vulnerable to being raped. Sex workers definitely are vulnerable, which is again why this is more of a grey area than necessarily entirely voluntary. Another category which is clearly involuntary is date rape. So you guys will know by now that Bill Cosby is in jail for, I don't know, having date raped over 50 women. This is where a woman is given a drug and she is literally unconscious, and you simply cannot consent to anything if you are unconscious. So that is another type of rape. And then we've touched on this a little bit already, but being sold into marriage, and that is often child brides. That does happen in this country. It often happens in places like the Middle East or India, where like a 9-year-old, a 12-year-old is literally sold for money to a 40, 50-year-old man. And then I will ask the class, what agency do you think that young girl has to refuse the sexual advances of her husband? And there'll be a lot of uncomfortable murmuring, and we all come to the conclusion that basically she's got no choice, because what are the other options? If she tries to refuse, she might be sent back to her family in disgrace. They have to pay the money back, and then she can be cast out of her family or out of the community. She can be raped. She can be physically assaulted. There are women who are stoned to death for things like this. So in that situation, there's very little you can do. There's also actually a lot of child brides in some of the cults in the US, where similarly, because everybody believes that it is acceptable, there's very little that young woman can do. Okay, then there's people who are institutionalized. And who are these people? Okay, there are lots of different categories. So people who are in care homes. So for example, physically, intellectually disabled, the elderly, they're at a much higher risk of being raped. Then we have patients in psychiatric hospitals. When I worked at Falkenberg, there was a woman in the acute ward who alleged that one of the ward staff had raped her. And I think it did happen, but it was incredibly difficult because she was acutely psychotic. So that makes you incredibly vulnerable, because who's going to believe your story? Prisoners, okay, that often applies to male prisoners, but certainly women prisoners as well. And lest we forget that places like hostels and residences, on our very own campus, there are women who have been raped in res repeatedly over the years. So these are the kind of categories, or the kind of far-reaching nature of rape, that it can happen anywhere to anyone. Okay, now let's move on to our grey areas. We've already moved these across, and let's add some others. So there's peer pressure. Some people will put that in the involuntary column. But peer pressure, it depends on your agency. The expectations of your peers about what you should be doing or should not be doing, whether you buy into that or engage in that or not, depends on how empowered you are, how much agency you have, etc. So it's a grey area because it could go either way. Then students will often say something like manipulation or revenge. In fact, they'll often put that in the voluntary column, which, I mean, we can leave it there if we must. But often, again, there are societal issues underpinning this. Sometimes students will say in the voluntary column that a woman will have sex in order to keep the man. So that could be because she loves the man or any number of reasons. But in our society, the men are often the breadwinners. So if a woman is having sex to try and keep her partner, it is often because of a societal inequity. So again, that would be something that would go in grey area. So manipulation or revenge, I don't know, we can keep it there. Yeah, it could be voluntary. Then another grey area, mental illness. Okay, so if you are acutely and psychotically manic, all your inhibitions are gone. So you're going to be spending all your money, you're going to be under the influence of all kinds of different substances, you're going to be running around the street naked, you're going to be having a lot more sex than you ordinarily would. So just because you're having sex in that state doesn't mean that you're being raped. But would you make the same decision if you were euthymic? Don't know. Maybe, maybe not. It's a grey area. Okay, and then one of the last ones to think about in grey area is, again, something that removes your inhibition is substances. So if you're under the influence of substances, beer goggles, you have sex with a guy you met at the bar, and you wake up in the morning and you're like, oh my God, what was I thinking? It could just be that. It doesn't mean to say that if you have sex when you're inebriated or slightly tipsy that you wouldn't have done it if you were sober, but it certainly does put it in a gray area, because were you fully able to consent or not? Okay, so now if we just have a visual of this, we've actually got quite a short list of reasons that women would have sex voluntarily. And now if we start adding up all of these issues and all of these issues, we have a lot more happening here in the involuntary and voluntary, gray area columns. And a lot of that has got to do with society and how society is structured, and how many, many women, especially in this country, are disempowered and lack that kind of agency. Okay, so we're going to stop this video now, and the next video will consider the next question of why do women fall pregnant.